I always knew from a very young age, well, most of my friends were like getting jobs at like, McDonald's or something like that, and I was still in high school, that I just was only into music, and that was the only thing I ever wanted to do. I didn't want to be involved with anything else. Even in school itself, it was like once school was over and I got that out of my way because it was a big thing that was always in my way. The only thing I wanted to do was either be in band practice or write music or do something with music. And obviously pressure from the parents was like, it's time to get a job. I just luckily, through people I knew, met this guy who was running a studio in Hollywood, and asked me if I would like to take a job with him. And it was mostly like, just scrubby intern work in the studio, just wrapping cables. And it was an old Latin house label, actually, and they had just put out a platinum record, and the label was expanding and the studio was expanding and a ton of gear. And they were kind of slowly going from their very old way of producing music into going into like some of the very first versions of Cubase that was coming out and producing digitally. And he used to give me this back studio room. It was an empty studio room where they used to actually just store vinyl records. It was just boxes and boxes of vinyls. And I was just asking him, hey, do you have a place where I can work on music? And when I would go back there, I'd look in the closet, and interestingly enough, he had like the very heroic, cliche techno machines in there, which was like the TR-808, the TR-909, and a 303. And they were just sitting there in the closet. And I think I made the connection with those because of like the very like mainstream branding of those instruments that used to be on people's t-shirts. It said Acid 303 that I used to see at parties, and it was something that I knew that it existed, but I had never really touched or played with it. And I had asked him, like, hey, what are you doing with these? And it's just sitting there. And he's like, I don't use that stuff anymore. I produce with Cubase now. I was like, okay. So you mind if I play with it? And he's like, yeah, sure. And he set me up a little table, and he taught me how to use the pattern sequencer and gave me a DAT machine for us to record to a DAT tape. And I can't even tell you the tremendous amount of hours we spent in that studio just making tracks with practically those three instruments. I was like 16 years old or 17, and I just didn't make those gateway, connections with anybody who would support it. And the label itself that I was working for, they were kind of like post electronic underground dance music stuff, and they were really going for this mainstream music. So I was making like these little acid house jams, and I'd be like, yo, check this out. I go to these parties on the weekends, and all the kids like this stuff, and they dance to it. Let's release this. And they're like, no one's gonna buy that crap. Those three machines that were in the studio, I ended up inheriting them eventually. Juan, who ran the studio, kind of at some point just didn't really feel like he needed him anymore. And at that point, the easiest solution for me to create music before I got them was to go computer-based. And I started out before even really knowing how to use any sequencers with stuff like Rebirth, which was my closest solution to having a 303 and an 808 and a 909, and getting into Logic and things like that, and was producing mainly on software. But it didn't really have as much connection with me as hardware did. There was something about actually sitting in front of the machine that I really wanted. So I ended up acquiring those, and it's just been a slow evolution from that. I started making records and finally put out my own record, and money started coming, and I bought a piece of gear anytime I could possibly get one. I've never really been like an analog purist by any sense. I mean, it's never been like a situation where I only love the way analog synthesizers sound and I'll only use analog synthesizers. Digital, software, analog, anything that inspired me to create music was something that I was really interested in. And I remember specifically like a very early version before Reactor was Reactor. I was using Generator, which was a way you can, build your own synthesizers via software. And I was really into Generator, and I was getting into computer applications and making music. But those two worlds, the software and hardware world, were not really fitting together for me. It was really hard to get my software to communicate with my hardware and hardware to communicate with my software. Maybe it was a lack of knowledge on my end, or just a lack of inspiration, or I don't know exactly why, but it just didn't work for me. The workflow wasn't working, and I felt like I needed to make a commitment. It was like, either you're just going to do this on hardware, or you're going to go completely software. And I decided to go the software route because at the time it seemed practical and it seemed affordable and kind of cutting edge maybe. And I just slowly started to dilute the studio. Hardware pieces were just flying off the shelves and selling, some Waldorf units I had and some old Roland gear that I had, and everything was just kind of going. And I dived in completely into software, and I produced software and made records on software for a really long period of time. But I started finding myself feeling kind of lost after a while. I wasn't really inspired to work on music anymore, and I felt like I needed that physical, tangible, thing that I really communicated and really had a good relationship with when I was younger, playing with these instruments. And slowly and surely the studio started building up again. And instead of just blowing cash on, instruments just because I had this fetish to buy, synthesizers, I tried my hardest, which I must say is actually quite difficult, to buy very practical hardware instruments that I would use daily and a lot. The modular system that I have has dramatically changed the way I make music. It's changed my entire path, or the kind of path that I've always set myself into creating music, because I've always kind of just sat down and opened up a DAW and actually decided to write a song from beginning to end. And the modular has changed that dramatically. I don't really do that anymore. I think the modular helped me discover myself how much I really love playing with gear more than sometimes I actually like writing music. And now what I do is I turn on the recorder and I find myself just sitting in front of the modular for 2 or 3 hours just working on patches, and the patch just slowly evolves and changes with every cable I plug into something and every knob I turn. The sound just completely evolves and morphs into something else. And then at the end of the day, I find myself just zoning out completely on the modular and making sounds. I've never been so addicted to anything else in my life. It's just something that I don't even know what to say. It's just crazy. That needs more. I just need more. And I'm really for me to have this case in this studio and just telling myself, look, there's no more room in this studio for another case, also is keeping myself in check. Because if I didn't put any limits on myself, I don't think I would ever stop. And that's a scary thing for me. At certain points in my life, I've always kind of felt a little alienated, like I didn't really quite fit in with anybody that I was quite around. I wasn't on the same level or into the same things. And it wasn't until I actually started, making friends and kind of starting to communicate a lot into the eurorack world that I actually started finding people that were very similar to myself. And I finally, had a big group of people I had a lot in common with on so many levels, not just the fascination with synthesizers, but in just basic communications and musical history and, all that stuff. And I've been able to make quite a bit of friends, and especially since a lot of the synth manufacturers were based here in Los Angeles, quite a few of them. Peter Grenader was doing the whole Plan B stuff here, and Gur from Tip Top Audio was here, and, so many of them were all here, and they've been really cool about it. I've always ran into them at synth meets or talked to them and had tons of questions, and it's never been this kind of like, and you get this a lot in the techno world, is this kind of like these pretentious walls that people put up where they just think they're too fucking good to talk to you, and like, totally, it's really hard to break those barriers with people, and I never had that experience with any of these Eurorack guys. As soon as I had a question, they gave me more answers than I even expected. They really, come down to the studio, check it out, let me show you some things, look what I'm working on, look what I'm doing. And it's like, I admire a lot of these guys, and don't know what else to say other than they pretty much rock.